They say that only the good Lord above can judge us for our sins. But what about those who take the law into their own hands? The Romang Empire had its own ways of extracting confessions and punishing the guilty, and some of them were just plain cruel. Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. And today we're going to learn about Romans invented water torture. So let's get to it. There was no shortage of people who claimed to have seen Jesus Christ after his crucifixion. In fact, there were so many alleged sightings that some started to claim they were not even seeing the true resurrected Jesus, but rather a demon masquerading as him. This was known as the impostor, and the impostor was supposedly even taken before the Sanhedrin for questioning. They wanted proof that he really was the Son of God. He didn't provide any, and instead was tortured with water in an effort to get him to recant his statements. To prove he wasn't the Messiah, the Sanhedrin poured water over his head to drive out the supposed demon inside him. Of course, this did not work, and it became the standard form of torture for anyone who claimed to be a follower of the new cult that had sprung up around Jesus. The Romans were well aware of this new religion and its message of peace and love. Of course, they weren't big fans of it since it threatened the stability of the empire. Any large gathering of people would eventually lead to the collapse of an empire. That is just a historical fact. You could see the writing on the wall because it had happened over and over again. The most recent example being the fall of the mighty Greek Empire. The Romans knew they needed to crack down on this new cult, or it would be the end of their empire too. And what better way to stop a cult than by instilling fear into its members? For the Romans, nothing said fear quite like water torture. Christians faced persecution throughout the Roman Empire, even during the relatively tolerant reign of Marcus Aurelius. Christians were often charged with being atheists since they refused to participate in traditional Roman religious ceremonies. Atheism was considered a capital offense since it undermined the social order, and disrespecting the emperor, who was considered divine, was high treason. So naturally, Christians were put to death for their beliefs, and the Romans used every method at their disposal to make these executions as painful as possible. Some were burned alive, others torn limb from limb by wild animals. But one of the more popular methods of execution was drowning. Christians were either drowned or forced to watch others drown. It was a fate worse than death itself. Christians held their faith close and were unwilling to renounce it, even when faced with torture. In fact, many of them seemed to grow stronger in their faith when they were mistreated. This only made the Romans angrier. They couldn't understand why these people wouldn't simply renounce their beliefs and save themselves. In response, they came up with even more creative ways to punish Christians, including water torture. One of the most famous examples of water torture during the Roman era was the death of Saint Lawrence. Lawrence was a deacon in the Roman Catholic Church, who was put to death in 258 AD 4, refusing to hand over church property to the Roman emperor. He was tortured in a number of ways, including being beaten with rods and having hot red oil poured over him. But the most painful form of torture he endured was being placed between two metal plates and having water slowly poured over him. The water caused his skin to burn and his flesh to blister. But Lawrence remained steadfast in his faith until he died. Another common form of water torture used by the Romans was the lead water technique. This involved pouring molten lead down the throat of the victim, which would burn their insides and cause them to scream in agony. Another technique was to force victims to drink a concoction of vinegar and salt, which would cause them to vomit up blood. There was also the practice of hydrocution, which involved immersing the victim in water up to their neck and then delivering blows to their head. This would cause concussions and eventually death. As you can imagine, the effects of water torture were brutal. Victims would often be left with permanent disabilities, such as blindness or paralysis. Others would die as a result of their injuries, and those who survived would be forever changed by their experiences. For some of the Romans, the use of water torture was a means to an end. They saw it as a necessary evil to be used only when other methods of extracting confessions or punishments failed. Others, however, embraced water torture as a way to maintain control and power. The sight of someone being tortured was enough to make others cower in fear, even if they hadn't done anything wrong. During the 1st century, the Roman Emperor Nero began a systematic persecution of Christians across the empire. This was likely due to a combination of factors, including the growing popularity of Christianity, which threatened the traditional Roman religion, and Nero's desire to find a scapegoat for the great fire that destroyed much of Rome. Nero blamed the fire on Christians and began persecuting them across the empire. This persecution resulted in the deaths of thousands of Christians, many of whom were tortured to death. One of the most infamous examples of this was the martyrdom of St. Peter. According to tradition, Peter was crucified upside down in Rome during the persecution of Christians under Nero. This was likely done to prevent Peter from committing suicide by hanging. Instead, he was left to die slowly from exhaustion and starvation. In the 2nd century, the Roman Emperor Hadrian also persecuted Christians within his empire. This persecution is believed to have been triggered by a rumor that the Christian emperor's wife, Vibia Sabina, was poisoned by a Christian. While there is no evidence to support this rumor, Hadrian responded by persecuting Christians across the empire. This resulted in the deaths of hundreds of Christians, many of whom were tortured to death. But it wasn't all bad news for Christians. During the 3rd century, the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus issued an edict granting Christians the right to worship freely in the Roman Empire. This marked the end of the official persecutions of Christians, although Christians continued to face persecution under some emperors during the following centuries. While the Romans invented a number of different forms of water torture, they were not the first to use water in this way. In fact, water torture has been used throughout history as a means of punishment and interrogation. The ancient Egyptians used a form of water torture known as the shaking ordeal. This involved binding the suspect's hands and feet and then dropping them into a deep hole filled with water. The water would cause the suspect to thrash around, which would eventually lead to their exhaustion and eventual death. The ancient Greeks also used a form of water torture known as the lead chamber. This involved placing the victim in a sealed chamber and then filling it with lead. The lead would displace the oxygen in the chamber, which would cause the victim to suffocate. So while the Romans were responsible for some of the most brutal forms of water torture, they were not the first to use water in this way. The Romans spread their wings far and wide, conquering much of the known world and bringing their culture and customs with them wherever they went. It was during this time that water torture became a popular form of entertainment. Imagine yourself at the Roman Colosseum, watching gladiators fight to the death. You've seen battles between man and beast, man and man, and even man and machine. But today's spectacle is different. Two men stand in a pool of water, swords drawn. They circle each other, looking for an opening. One lunges forward, but his opponent is too quick and easily dodges the attack. The crowd cheers as the fight rages on. Finally, one of the gladiators falls, his sword clattering to the ground as he succumbs to his wounds. The crowd goes wild with excitement. Such fights were not uncommon during the days of the Roman Empire. In fact, there were even special events held in which gladiators would fight to the death in underwater arenas. These spectacles were designed to be as exciting and brutal as possible, and they often drew large crowds of spectators. While there is no record of gladiators fighting underwater in actual battle, it is likely that the skills they developed in the arena would have been useful in real combat. After all, fighting in water makes a warrior more vulnerable, and those who are skilled in both swordplay and underwater combat would have been truly formidable opponents. The Roman Empire was known for its brutality, and nowhere was this more evident than in its treatment of prisoners of war. When the Romans conquered a city, they would often kill all of the inhabitants, sparing only those who submitted and pledged allegiance to Rome. Even these lucky ones were treated harshly, with entire families being enslaved and sent to work in mines or on farms. For the Romans, it was simply a fact of life. In fact, it was expected. And those who didn't live up to these standards were punished severely. That's why the Romans invented water torture. If you liked this video, please leave a thumbs up. Also, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you next time.